Game of Thrones prequel, House of Dragon, episode 1. I have been waiting for this prequel for however long it's been since they announced it. Game of Thrones, one of my favorite, all-time favorite series. Yeah, the last season was a little sketchy. There was a lot of criticism, particularly around the ending as it related to the Targaryens. So I'm glad that they took this opportunity to tell that story. I still stand behind the series. It was just excellent. There's nothing else like it. So even if they messed up a little bit at the end, it still doesn't take away from what Game of Thrones was. So I say this all to say that I was very excited about this show. And I watched on Sunday night and I absolutely loved it. I thought it was very well done and I am all in. And I wanted to do a review and tell you a little bit about what I thought about it and start this conversation with other Game of Thrones fans throughout the rest of the season. I'm glad they did this because, well, number one, I thought Game of Thrones could have lasted longer. There was just so much more story to tell. But I understand that they did have to, bring it to a close at some point. But I also thought this was great because the Targaryens were never really my favorite house. I mean, like many people, I was, down with House Stark for the most part. But Daenerys was never, I never got drawn in by Daenerys. I know she was a huge fan favorite. And then at the end, she really, no spoiler alerts if you haven't watched it, but, she turned out to not be what a lot of people thought. And you get the impression from watching the series that the Targaryens were just a bunch of crazy, violent, extreme individuals. And a lot of that, they go back, they talk about the Mad King a lot, and again, they have a long-standing dynasty. The Mad King is only one chapter in that story, but there's so much reference to him in Game of Thrones. So we know that, and we anchor, I believe, at least I anchored their bloodline to him. And, there was also all of the inbreeding that they did to keep their blood pure. And, Daenerys' brother in the beginning of Game of Thrones, he was a piece of shit. The whole story with Jon Stark kind of tied around Daenerys' oldest brother. I believe his name is Rhaegar Targaryen, and Ned Stark's sister. So that also left a taste in my mouth that didn't put the Targaryens in the best light. I'll just put it that way. So this was really good to learn more about the family, to see them when they were in power and during peaceful times. You know, besides Daemon, which we'll get into later, they're all pretty likable characters at this point, at least. So I was just glad to get a little bit of perspective and just look at them with a fresh set of eyes. So let's just jump right into the episode. We begin with it talking about old King Jaehaerys. So at this point, he had reigned for about 60 years in Westeros, and he has failing health. He does not have any sons. Two of his sons had died by through some tragedy, and he has no male heirs. And so if you follow these stories, or even just true history, having a male heir was paramount. He knew that if he did not do something about this in his lifetime, that this could tear apart the country. He called for the council to decide who his new heir will be. It came down to two people: Princess Rhaenys, who was his eldest descendant. I believe she was his granddaughter, one of his son's daughters, and her cousin Viserys, who was his eldest male descendant. Now, by right, it would make sense that his eldest descendant would inherit the throne, but this is a very patriarchal society, so it is not surprising that they choose Viserys. This story is being narrated by King Viserys' daughter and only child, Renera. We jump to present day, which is about 100 years prior to the Game of Thrones timeline. We're about 10 years into Viserys' reign, and we get a little bit of a lay of the land. The story being told by Renera, we see that her mother is pregnant, and her name is Queen Emma, I believe. And she's in the very late term of her pregnancy, and you can tell that it is miserable. She's very uncomfortable. We learn later that she has, she only has the one daughter, so there is a lot of weight being put on this child being a male heir. It's a very uncomfortable pregnancy for her. We see a conversation with her and Renera, which lets us know that they have a really strong, close mother-daughter relationship. And we learn a little bit about Renera. Her mother tells her, one day you'll be here, because pregnancy and childbirth is how women serve the realm. Renera is not really interested in that. We learned that she's more interested in, riding dragons and exploring the world. I get a little bit of Arya from her. She doesn't want that traditional female path. She wants to be a soldier, possibly a warrior, do more of that. And I think that also might tie in with the fact that feels she's made to feel inadequate because she's a daughter. Now, I believe she has a great relationship with both of her parents, but obviously he needs a son. And that's going to be what pretty much this whole episode is about. And it has to feel a way that your presence is not enough, where the world, the region, the realm is ready to celebrate the birth only if it's a son. And by right, she is the eldest child, but like we learned in the beginning, because it's such a patriarchal society, women were not allowed to lead. So she feels set aside, and perhaps that's why she wants to abandon this whole traditional female role, because she sees that there's, and I'm putting words in her mouth, obviously, but maybe there's no value in it. Like if my job is only to be brought up just to be reared so that I could become pregnant and give birth, like, what's the value in that? She notices even with her mother how there's so many people who are rallying around her to make sure that the birth goes well for the sake of her delivering a boy and having an heir for the realm, as opposed to them actually caring about her mother. So we see that that's kind of where her mindset is, and I think that's really going to play out in the rest of the episode and the rest of the season. We jump to a council meeting. King Viserys sitting at the head of the table, and I imagine was a small council meeting. And they talk a little bit about the tournament that they're about to hold. So Viserys is hosting a huge tournament. He is inviting nobles and leaders from other parts of the realm to celebrate in anticipation of his son's birth. Now, obviously, they don't know that it's going to be a boy. They don't know if there'll be a healthy delivery. I mean, there's so many unknowns here, but he's having a party to celebrate this in anticipation of what he believes is going to happen. So they talk a little bit about this tournament. They talk about Daemon. So we have Prince Daemon Targaryen, who is Viserys' younger brother. He's a wild card. He's been named the commander of the City Watch, also known as the Gold Cloaks. He's supposed to be part of the council, right? I mean, we saw in Game of Thrones that the members of the council were those who held very important roles in the realm, and they advised the king, and they were present. And Daemon is nowhere to be found. This is especially troublesome for Otto Hightower, who is the hand of the king. We see that we're still later that there's some bad blood between the two of them. They do not get along, and King Viserys is running interference often between the two of them. And Otto was bringing up, like, why is he not around? We gave him this position. He needs to be sitting at this table with the rest of us. He does show up, actually, and he's showing up because of the tournament, really. And we see a scene in which he is sitting on the Iron Throne, which is taboo because that is the seat for the king. And he's having a conversation with his niece, Renera. And we learn here that they have a nice uncle-niece relationship. They talk a little bit about, why she comes in, she sees him sitting on a throne. She's like, what the hell are you doing? And, he speaks in jest, but there's a lot of truth underneath where we get a sense that he is interested in being the successor of King Viserys. And technically, if the king never has any children, he could be the heir as the next eldest. But we know that the queen is pregnant, and the goal is that she has a son. He says in jest that he heard that there was being a tournament held in honor of the king's next heir, which could be him if the king doesn't have any children, but obviously we know that she's pregnant. So we get a glimpse into his head, and we see how he thinks and what his agenda is, and what he ultimately wants. The irony here is that he doesn't seem to take his professional responsibilities seriously, or he is a little rash and impulsive. And those aren't the characteristics of a good king. Not to say that we haven't seen kings who are like that, but it's just a little ironic that he is interested in this role when he's not even interested in sitting at council meetings. It feels like it's a power thing for him, but this scene lets us know that he is to be watched and that he might be a problem moving forward. In a nice moment between the two of them, he gifts Rhaenyra with a necklace made out of Valyrian steel. And we all know, the significance of Valyrian steel from Game of Thrones. So the significance of this gift shouldn't be ignored. Next, we see a scene with Viserys and Emma, Queen Emma. And this was touching because there's so many times in stories like this where we see that the relationships are business transactions. And oftentimes there's not a lot of love between husband and wife because, these folks were betrothed to each other. These were deals that they made in order to um, create alliances and things of that nature. Often they weren't relationships based on true love. And it's obvious that these two love each other, and he cares about his wife's welfare. She tells him while she's in the bathtub that this is going to be her last pregnancy. It's clearly problematic for her. She mentions how she's had 5 dead babies so far. I think 1 died in the cradle. She had 2 miscarriages and maybe 2 stillbirths. So their only child is Rhaenyra, and there is a lot of pressure on this child being born and being a boy, and she knows that, and she feels guilty because she feels it's her duty. Like she told her daughter earlier, like this is how women serve the realm, and the fact that she is not able to do this, it weighs heavy on her. Particularly because we saw how this is how King Viserys came into power in the beginning, because the old king did not have any heirs. So it's very important, and they want to keep the realm safe. They don't want this to, expand into some type of battle or war throughout the realm. But you can't control these things. You can't control any of it. And she tells him, hey, it may not be a boy, and this is just not going well for me, and I really won't be able to do this again. That's going to be important later when we see a scene when she actually starts to go into labor. But it was just nice to see the closeness and the love and the affinity between the two of them, because that is rare in these type of worlds. Daemon had been named the commander of the City Watch, also known as the Gold Cloaks. Apparently, crime has risen in King's Landing. So it would make sense that they would invest some resources in policing and, decreasing crime, making King's Landing a safe place to be. Now, Daemon has taken this to another level. We see him amping up his troops, running through the city, and just being brutal, murdering people, mutilating folks, cutting off body parts, and he does it with such joy and passion. At the end, he even has a wagon of body parts as evidence of what he's done throughout the city that evening. I mean, it's horrific. And it shines a light on him to show just how brutal he can actually be. I'm pretty sure this is some kind of a foreshadowing of what we're going to see later. When the council learns this, Otto Hightower is pissed. He already does not like Daemon. But, he's right. This is not how things are supposed to be done. Absolutely. You might have to put a heavy hand down because there is crime and you need to stop this. You want your citizens to be safe. But, they should not be in terror of the king's police force. But that's exactly the environment that Daemon created. He defends himself saying, I'm doing this because, you're about to have a tournament. You're going to be bringing in people from other places. We don't want anything to happen to them when they get here. True, but obviously what he did was extreme. Otto is pissed. We learned that this is not the first job that Daemon has had. He has been put in charge of other offices and he messed all of those up. And so now he's here in this place and he's messing this one up too. Now, Viserys is kind of, being pulled in 2 different directions. There is obviously the tension between his brother and his hand. And we see that he tries to be the peacemaker between the two of them. He lets Otto know that this is my brother and this is the charge we gave him, and while he was extreme, his intentions were made sense. But on the flip side, he tells his brother, like, you gotta dial it back. You can't keep doing this. This does not reflect well on us. Daemon knows that he has, in this scene, I also recognize how much Daemon realizes how much influence he has over his brother, or at least in the sense that his brother cares about him and he does show that he has his back. And that's probably why he's been so reckless all these years, because he knows that his brother ultimately is going to support him. Um, but clearly he's taking advantage of the relationship. So we fast forward to the tournament, and it's the typical tournament you'd see, lots of pomp and circumstance. It's quite brutal. The soldiers are tearing each other up both on horse and on the ground, and everybody is watching and cheering, and it's a jovial event because this is to be celebrating their new king, their future king. At the same time, they juxtapose this with the scene of Emma going into labor, and it's a hard labor for her. We got hints at this before in the other two scenes in which we saw her, where it's not going well. We learned that the child is breech, and she's having problems delivering. When Viserys goes and he speaks to the Grand Maester, and he's like, what, give her something for her pain. And the Maester's like, we already gave her some milk of the poppy. We don't want to hurt the baby. And he confronts him with a very, very difficult decision. He tells him that you might have to make a choice between her life and the baby's life, or or you might just lose both of them. I mean, that's the way that it's starting to look. The implication here is that she might die either way. So Viserys is obviously distraught with the decision that he has to make. There's a lot of weight on his shoulders here. He doesn't want the Targaryen reign to crumble under his watch. Feels like he has a duty and obligation to present an heir to secure the realm. He knows, because of the conversation he had previously with his wife, that this is her last shot. Even if she survives, she likely won't be able to do this again, or she just won't be willing to do it. So there's a lot at stake here. And this is coupled with the fact that he has to act immediately. He makes the decision to save the baby. And the maester tells him that they have this new procedure, which would be known as, I guess, a common day C-section, in which they would just cut her open and pull the baby out. And the maester says, we can do that, but she will bleed to death. And he makes that decision. It was really hard. I'm really surprised. And again, I don't know Viserys. We don't know Viserys very well at this stage. We do know, we get the sense he's a good man and he has the best of intentions. But he sacrificed his wife. And not only did he sacrifice her, well, there's a couple of things here. He sacrificed his wife with no guarantee that there was going to be a live birth, the child would live, that it would be a boy. So, I mean, there were so many variables, unknown variables on the opposite end of him choosing a child. But on the flip side, if she was not going to survive, which is the impression that I received, then I guess he had to give it a shot, right? And then to make matters worse, he doesn't even tell her. And I don't know, like, how would you tell somebody that? Like, hey, I'm about to sacrifice your life for me. They're about to cut you open and you're going to die. That was the worst part for me, watching the fear in her eyes when she realized what was happening to her. They made a decision about this woman's life, and she had no say so, and she wasn't even aware that it was happening. She couldn't even brace herself, get herself together. She didn't have a moment to say goodbye. She has another daughter who she's never going to see. I mean, this was horrible. And as horrible as it was to watch, I could imagine it was that much worse for Viserys, for him to have to make that decision. And he does, and he keeps telling her that they're going to save the babe. They're going to save the babe. And holds her hand, tells her he loves her, and they proceed to cut her open and pull the child out, and we watch her bleed to death and die. Word gets out to the rest of the council because they're all at the tournament, and they start telling each other what happened. We learn later that the child did not survive. So it was an absolute loss on all sides, on all levels. We see them at the funeral with both bodies wrapped. They are going to cremate them both using the dragon's fire. We can see that Viserys is a shell of himself, knowing that this is this was all him. He created that. This was his decision that got them to this point. Obviously, Renera is distraught. Her mother is dead. We learn later that she does blame her father, or she feels, well, she knows he's responsible for this. Um, and Daemon, and I feel like Daemon is going to be one of those characters where we're going to kind of vacillate back and forth with him. We see what he's capable of. We see the brutality, the impulsiveness, the rage. Like we know he is not. He can be a monster, but we see him love his loving relationship with his niece. Um, and then he has a little bit of it humanizes him, right? He tells at the funeral, he sees that his brother is going to be incapable of making the call for the dragon to blow fire and to cremate the bodies. So he tells his niece that your father needs you right now. And she makes the call, which we know from Game of Thrones is Jaeharys, and the dragon comes down from the top of the hill, and he breathes fire onto the bodies and essentially cremates them. Shortly after the funeral of his wife and his son, the small council decides that they want to talk about the succession. And this is really Otto Hightower, the Hand of the King, who initiates this conversation. He tells them, I know this is a bad time, but this is something that we got to talk about. We have to make a decision here. Viserys is still in mourning. They go around the table all kind of making their giving their suggestion. Some folks say, well, it will be Daemon because he's next in line, he's your brother. There are some who say it should be your daughter, and then there are others who will say, well, no, because that's not precedent. We've never had a woman be king, or say we've never had a woman be queen. We don't do that. But then they say, well, there might be some others who are potential heirs. And this is where Lord Corlys brings this up. We see he is the one of the few black members, one of the few black characters in the Game of Thrones series. We saw a couple in Game of Thrones, but it's good to see a main character here just to show a little bit of diversity. And Lord Corlys is married to Rhaenys, who was the granddaughter of the old king who got passed up for the throne in favor of Viserys. So she does have royal blood, and she is a potential heir, and it does behoove Lord Corlys to bring it up because that is his wife, and if his wife becomes queen, obviously it's going to be advantageous for him, which is going to be something that we'll see later in the season, possibly the series. So everybody's kind of just throwing names out there. There's a lot of dissension amongst them, and Viserys is not here. He is distraught, and he doesn't want to talk about it right now. Understandably so. We also notice that Daemon is in the background listening through the other wall. Next, Otto Hightower sends a raven to Old Town. Don't know what's in that message, but obviously it's important and it will come up later. Then we see him have a conversation with his daughter. His daughter Alicent is best friends with Renera. Looks like they probably grew up together. And he tells his daughter that she should go visit the king and comfort him in his time of mourning. So she's a little bit surprised, like why would I go and comfort the king? Like what would I say to him? It just seems awkward. Then he tells her to wear one of her mother's dresses. This was an uncomfortable scene. My takeaway is that he is trying to install his daughter so that she could be the next queen. The king can still remarry. He can still have more children and have heirs. So Otto was probably thinking, well, why not my daughter? This is very similar to some of the storyline we saw in The Other Boleyn Girl, in which, or I guess in that time period, but specifically in that movie, in which some ambitious parents would push their young daughter in front of a king to get his attention, be it to get him to sleep with them so that the family would receive some kind of favor, possibly have a baby, so that, they would keep themselves close to the crown, perhaps even escalate to the point of marriage. And this is what this smacks of. He's looking at the long game and seeing, okay, we having an issue with these heirs here. Maybe if I foster some type of relationship between my daughter and the king, he might, I don't know, fall in love with her, but he may decide to marry her and make her his next wife. She's Alicent is equally confused or uncomfortable with this, but clearly she has no decision. We later see her go to visit the king, and she brings him a book about history because apparently that's something he's interested in. And she tries to make a connection between the two of them because her mother has died before this season started, and she tries to connect with him on that level. She says, when my mom died, a lot of people came to me and said, shared a lot of riddles, but no, all I really wanted was somebody just to say that they were sorry. So I'm telling you that I'm sorry. And there's a seed planted here. Viserys is a little confused as to why she's visiting him, and he doesn't seem at all interested in her. And why would he be? He just lost his wife. That's his daughter's friend. She's young enough to be his daughter. I mean, there's 1,000 reasons why he would not be interested in her. But he receives her condolences. Back to Daemon. He likes to frequent these houses of pleasure, what I guess we would call whorehouses or houses of ill repute. He apparently rents one out for all of his soldiers in the city watch. And I don't know if he was drunk. I imagine he was drinking, but he makes a toast to his dead nephew, calling him heir for the day. Clearly, this is in poor taste. It's just cruel. But Daemon seems to not have any boundaries. And he does what he wants. He says what he wants. He seems a little self-destructive because he has to know that this is going to get back to his brother, which it does. Otto tells the king, and the king is livid. Now, he's given a lot of latitude to his brother. We saw it throughout this whole episode. But this is where he really crossed the line. And when his brother calls him in, he asks him, "Did you say it?" And Daemon tells him that he did. He tries to backpedal himself out of it a little bit, but this was right here is where he really crossed the line. And they have a brother to brother argument. And Viserys makes some really good points. He tells him, "I've only ever defended you. I've always looked out for you. Like, why would you do this to me?" And then we learn that Daemon is pissed because he believes that his brother keeps passing him over. The tournament for the new heir. Maybe before this, he wasn't even considering his brother as an heir. Daemon brings up the fact that he's never asked him to be hand of the king. And he tells Viserys that you're weak. And that none of those other men would protect him the way that Daemon would. And that he was there. He wanted to be there to protect Viserys from himself. And then he calls him weak. And this does not go over well. Viserys has had it up to here with him. And he essentially just banishes him from court. It looks like the recent events, had Viserys thinking a lot about what he needs to do next. He calls in Renera to have a conversation. I think it's I want to say the dragon pit or something like that, where there is the skull of one of the old famous dragons, and there's a bunch of candles, and he brings Renera in, and he essentially apologizes to her for always having passed her by because she's a daughter, and for not seeing her and recognizing her. The two of them are both in mourning, so I believe that this was a bonding moment for the two of them away from everybody else to really talk and have a father-daughter moment. He tells her about the Song of Fire and Ice, which is the dream that their ancestor Aegon had. And this apparently is a trade secret that is passed down from king to king. And it's a dream that Aegon had about the end of man, fire and ice. So it's the whole concept of winter is coming, which we're all familiar with from Game of Thrones. And the belief that there was this entity, which we'll later learn are the White Walkers, that will come from the north and will be the cause of the end of humanity. And the Targaryens believe that it is their duty and responsibility to stay on the throne so that they keep Westeros united so that they could fight this threat. And him telling Rhaenyra about this is essentially like a symbolic passing of the sword, letting her know that this will be your responsibility one day, and I need you to have all the information and know what you need to do and why it's so important that we maintain our role as the head of the realm. In the final scene, we are in the throne room, and all of the lords from the other parts of the country have come to pledge their fealty to Princess Rhaenyra. It was interesting to see the leaders of the different houses. So we saw House Baratheon, we saw House Stark, just a little nod to all of the houses and all of the families that we know from Game of Thrones. But this was a moment, a monumental moment, because this was a turn for them. They had never installed a woman into leadership, and he is making a decision to do this, even though it had never been done before. And he is making sure that all of the people who essentially report to him are on board and that they will support her the same way that they support him. There were some mixed reviews, you know, we saw some faces. I think it's specifically by Baratheon. I can't remember his first name. Whereas if he bent the knee, but it didn't seem like he really wanted to. But they know that they have to pledge support because they have to get behind the king's decision, or at least they have to while he's alive. And lastly, we see Daemon taking off on one of his dragons. So, extremely good episode. You know, it had all the makings, all the elements of Game of Thrones that we all loved. And this is gonna, you know, there was a lot of foreshadowing in here. I know a little bit of the story between now and Game of Thrones, so I don't want to give out any spoiler alerts about what's going to happen, but clearly there is going to be some battle going on, a battle of wills and a battle of alliances, and we are going to watch Princess Renera come into her own, um, you know, and step into those huge shoes. And I imagine that her innocence and her youth are probably behind her at this point, because she's going to be exposed to a lot and see what this really looks like to be the queen of a realm. I cannot wait until next week to see what happens next. I saw the previews, and it looked like the previews were for the entire season, so all of that's not going to happen next week, but it was very good. And I am happy to be able to do these reviews week by week. This will take us into probably, I don't know, October or something like that. But let me know what you think, what you thought. Let's not do predictions, because if you read the books or if you've kind of followed this, you probably know what's going to happen next, and we don't want to mess it up for other people. But what did you think about this episode, and where do you think this is going to go for the rest of the season and all that good stuff? So thank you for watching, and I look forward to your comments on my review of episode 1. Don't forget to like, to share, and to subscribe. And if you subscribe and you hit the notification button, you will get a notification as soon as I post my new video every week. Thanks. Bye.